Right, because from what I understand, this whole case will probably hinge on Gucci Mane not just cooperating, but actually taking the stand.
That's correct. Because if the story that he initially told, if he did tell the story is not true, then he would have, filed a false complaint. Why would you want to put your best artist that's made you millions of dollars back in federal custody for a decade or more?
Big30’s lawyer just exposed how Gucci Mane is about to lose this case against Pooh Shiesty. But before we break down how Gucci Mane is cooked, we need to talk about the new details in the case.
Okay, this is a federal case because they're saying that he crossed state lines coming from Memphis, Tennessee, or coming from Tennessee, entered into the state of Texas to commit a robbery and to commit kidnapping. That was his intent. So the government has to prove that he had the intent, and that was his reason for coming there. And again, as I've explained, they recorded music in that studio multiple times, and they had recorded music, from my understanding, the day before. And that was his reason for being there. So I think you still run into the issue of the intent.
So this is Big30’s lawyer, Arthur Horn. And the first problem that Gucci Mane and the FBI are going to run into is proving that Pooh Shiesty had planned this before he came to Dallas. That's what makes this a federal case in the first place. But how would the FBI know that? They would need to have a snitch or somehow have tapped his phones prior to, which is not impossible. I mean, he did just get out of jail, but how would the feds know that specifically? But keep watching because it gets even worse. Like, comment, and subscribe. We are currently at 12K, on our way to 50K. That is my goal. I'm trying to hit 50K this year. So if you want to help me hit 50K, please like, comment, and subscribe. That helps the video.
Even if you take the intent out of the equation, they're still saying a crime occurred in that studio.
Well, but now the feds are involved, so there has that. If it's a state case, right, then that's different. But this is a federal case, so part of what they have to prove is that he had the intent of coming across state lines to commit these particular acts. And what's telling to me is if Pooh Shiesty had this gun drawn on Gucci Mane, why isn't he charged with a 924G or 922G?
What is that?
Felon in possession of a handgun.
At the moment, Pooh Shiesty and his co-defendants haven't been indicted. It's only a criminal complaint. And in the criminal complaint, Pooh Shiesty hasn't been charged, or they aren't accusing him of having a firearm. Well, they accuse him of having a firearm, but there's no physical evidence of him having a firearm. I know the feds have to be scratching their head right now and thinking to themselves, wow, maybe Pooh Shiesty isn't as dumb of a criminal as we thought. But keep watching because it doesn't matter if the feds are involved or not.
Okay, so you hear the feds taking on state cases sometimes, but can the state take on a fed case?
The feds can opt out of taking this case and hand it over to the DA in Dallas, and they can decide whether they want to indict it or not.
Are you worried about that?
I think we're confident knowing the facts are very different than the facts that are in the criminal complaint and the facts that we know about in this case. We're very confident that we see this very differently.
Is the case combined with all 9 co-defendants, or are they going to have separate trials?
Well, if they're going under the guise that this is a conspiracy, then they would try them all together.
It's over. Could you imagine if the feds hand over a well-wrapped case to the police department showing all the evidence that they have about Pooh Shiesty? Phone records, where was he at, everything? Because the only thing separating this from a federal case and a state case is when did his intention to rob Gucci Mane happen? If they can't prove it, that he already had the intention, already planned this in Memphis, then it's a state case in Dallas. But at the same time, they're not disputing. It doesn't sound like they're disputing if the robbery happened. It just sounds like if they're disputing the intentions, honestly. When did the intentions happen? You know what I mean? And if Big30 wants his case separate from Pooh Shiesty, aren't you kind of throwing Pooh Shiesty under the bus saying that, yeah, man, I just came here to record some music. I didn't know nobody was going to get robbed or this, that, and the third. Like, how is this going to work? Because at the same time, Big30 might be trying to find his way out of it, but it sounds like you throwing Pooh under the bus.
Pooh Shiesty placed the barrel of a gun to the back of BP's head and ordered him and Gucci Mane to leave the control room and the studio through the west entrance of the office building. So then Gucci told head of security and a second security to escort them to the vehicle. As the victims were leaving, Gucci's cameraman, Matt, turned to Pooh Shiesty to ask him if they're really taking his watches, which ultimately I guess they did. And after this all happened, they actually got surveillance footage where the target suspects left the studio and the office building around 4:48 p.m. There was AirTag locations where the bag was and so forth. And then exterior surveillance videos showed that a white Buick Enclave, a black Hellcat, and a black Dodge Ram were leaving the location. And the Hearst confirmed that the Buick was actually rented by Pooh Shiesty's dad. Gucci Mane and his cameraman Matt described Pooh Shiesty as wearing a black Nike brand Shiesty mask, a black hooded shirt, and black pants during the offense. So does this imply that Gucci Mane actually is cooperating with the feds?
It sounds like it from your dissertation, but also, I mean, this weekend we saw a video where he came out and said that he wasn't cooperating with the police. That's not what he does. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically, or essentially, he's not cooperating in this investigation.
Well, right, because according to the complaint, Gucci Mane, Matt, and BP identified Big30 actually being present during the incident. So once again, it seemed like Gucci was cooperating with the feds by pointing the finger at your client.
It would sound that way, so I'm not sure whether to believe what he said over the weekend or what's in this criminal complaint. And that's sort of leaves me scratching my head as to this whole case.
So earlier this week, Gucci Mane's lawyer publicly spoke and said that Gucci Mane won't be cooperating in the case against Pooh Shiesty. But his name is already in the criminal complaint paperwork, pointing out Pooh Shiesty and Big30 by name. My theory, Gucci Mane never thought that this case would see the light of day, or at least he thought his name wouldn't see the light of day on the paperwork. You know what I mean? That's why he's publicly coming out and saying this. Or it's really people on his team saying this, and somehow they're saying it's Gucci Mane's name. But ultimately, I just think Gucci Mane didn't think this case would see the light of day.
Going forward, the interesting part from our perspective will be if you have cooperating victims.
Right, because from what I understand, this whole case will probably hinge on Gucci Mane not just cooperating, but actually taking the stand.
That's correct.
Right, because if Gucci says, no comment, I'm not going to show up, could he be forced to actually show up in Memphis? Because he lives in Georgia.
The alleged
right?
incident happened in
Dallas.
So
bad.
he would
Texas,
have to show up in Dallas if he's subpoenaed, but he could plead the fifth, because if the story that he initially told, if he did tell the story, is not true, then he would have, filed a false complaint. But again, looking at what he said this weekend, unless he's just putting that out there for the public so that people don't think that he's a cooperating witness with the government.
The entire case rides on Gucci Mane's testimony, because it seems like the feds don't have a lot of physical evidence at all. They don't have any guns. They don't have the contract. They seem like they might not have any text messages. All they have is the records of Pooh Shiesty being there and the records of them stealing the cameraman's items. But outside of that, all of this rides on Gucci Mane, bro. Gucci Mane has to get on that stand and point out Pooh Shiesty and said, Pooh Shiesty and Big30 and his team did this to me. Otherwise, they walk and Gucci Mane, he loses this case. But could you imagine, could you really imagine the state of hip hop and what would happen if Gucci Mane would be the biggest rat ever, bro? Bigger than 6ix9ine.
Why would you want to put your best artist that's made you millions of dollars back in federal custody for a decade or more?
But here's a possible dilemma. From the outside looking in, it appears that Gucci signed this release under duress. Now, if it's proven that it was signed under duress, then the contract is thrown out and Pooh Shiesty is still signed to Gucci for however many albums. But if Gucci says nothing happened, I'm not going to say that it was signed under duress, then the release is valid. And Pooh Shiesty is no longer signed to a Gucci Mane. So there's that angle to look at. I don't know how serious it is. Me personally, if I was Gucci, I would just let it go.
I'm not taking no $10 to $15 million loss, bro. If I'm Gucci Mane, I'm getting on that stand, I'm pointing out Pooh Shiesty, bro. I'm sorry, bro. All you had to do, Pooh Shiesty, was turn in a couple projects, do a tour, and you probably was out of your contract, bro. And you could have got with your guy in maybe like a year and a half, 2 years, 6 months if you really worked hard enough. But Draco to my head and a $15 million loss, bro, I'm not going like that, bro. But leave it in the comments how y'all feel about the entire situation. Is Gucci Mane cooked, or is Pooh Shiesty about to do life in jail? Let me know in the comments how you guys feel. And if you like this video, you'll probably like my last video about Charleston White and the baby